Hello, everyone. Please take your seats for the next session. Welcome to this panel on the Maritime ETS. My name is Kate Abnett. I'm a journalist for Reuters. I cover climate change and energy in Brussels. With the extension of the EU ETS to the maritime sector, around 12,000 ships worldwide are expected to be covered by the EU carbon market. So in this session, we are going to discuss the challenges and the implications of that expansion of the ETS. And joining me to do this are three experts. We're joined by José Tourneau, who is the trading floor manager at the Dutch trading house ACT Commodities Group in Amsterdam, where he leads their EU ETS activities in Europe. ACT works with clients to support their participation in both compliance carbon markets like the ETS and voluntary carbon markets. Tryfon Tsentides is head of sustainability at IFCO Galbraiths. It's a leading international shipbroking company. He supports their global shipping clients in their transition to decarbonization. And next to me, we have Nico Giraud, who is the co-founder and the chief technology officer at Clearblue Markets, where he analyzes prices in carbon markets. Clearblue assists clients in the shipping industry with monitoring and tracking allowances and developing their compliance strategies. And I should also mention that two of our panelists are actually working together on this very topic. So IFCO Galbraiths and Clearblue launched a partnership which focuses specifically on the shipping industry, under which they assist ship owners with their ETS compliance. So we have scant time, so I'm just going to jump straight in with questions. The ETS Maritime has already begun this year. The first deadline for actually surrendering allowances is September 2025. So, Tryfon, can you kick us off? Can you give us a flavor of how far, so far, how has the introduction of the ETS Maritime affected the sector, and how is the industry adapting to it?
Thank you, Kate. I would say, okay, so for the shipping industry, I think the EU ETS, the inclusion of the maritime sector into the system, is really the first, I would say, moment that the ship owners, the shipping players, have to pay for their carbon in real terms. I mean, there are previously, I would say, the carbon metrics were getting tougher on the global regulations of the IMO, and those were sort of hidden costs. Here now, we really are, let's say, faced with actually handing over money to trade in and out of Europe. So for the shipping industry, this is a very first sort of, let's say, a moment that they have to actually really get the checkbook out and write a check for this. I would say the shipping industry is quite a sort of dynamic industry. I think we're quite innovative. I think we managed to adapt quite well to sort of these regulations in a way. It's not without a struggle. I think we have some shipping players who are quite advanced, and then we have some players who are quite behind and not in denial, but let's say trailing behind a little bit. So yeah.
Okay, thank you for that intro. Nico, I'll turn to you. With a world-first sort of measure like this, there are always teething problems, and I wondered, in your view, what is the biggest challenge so far that the sector has faced with regard to the EU ETS? Right now, it's a question of data collection. So can ship owners actually access the data they need? Can they open the accounts they're going to need to comply with the system?
So yeah, thanks a lot for the question. Yeah, there is a lot of issue they're facing at the moment. In the past, they were used to do a DMRV, so there was already data published on the EU level on their emission data. That said, it wasn't something that really mattered to them because there wasn't really a cost. But now with having a cost, they're actually trying to understand really better those emissions, tracking those emissions as well ahead as when the vessel goes somewhere, trying to estimate emission. That's one of the tools that actually IFCO developed to estimate emissions before a vessel goes from A to B. That's the first thing. And then the second point is indeed on the account. That's something that kept us busy in Q1, where everyone was running around to open these accounts. They're still trying to open accounts. Also, something I mentioned earlier is actually all of those companies set up like SPVs specifically for each vessel. So they have a lot of different entities that they have to set up at the EU level in a lot of different countries as well. So we have clients facing opening accounts in 6, 7 countries. So that's the main thing. And then the thing coming after that is actually transacting, buying those allowances. Some of them don't have an account yet, but though they're already facing some costs. So that's an issue that is happening day to day, and trying to find solutions around that. Yeah.
Given those challenges, are you confident that the sector will actually have what it needs in terms of the data on emissions and the EUAs in the right accounts in time for the compliance deadline?
So that's, like as Trifon mentioned, some of them were very ready and there will be no issue there. Some others, it will probably be tougher. They're still trying to really understand the regulation, what it means to them. There's also a lot of discussions between who should actually pay for those allowances. Should it be the charterer who's actually taking the vessel from A to B, or should it be the owner? The owner is ultimately responsible, so they will take care of surrendering those allowances. But the charterers might be a company in Asia or South America that doesn't know much about the EU ETS and the compliance needs. So it will be a challenge, and I think it's pretty similar to, I think, what we saw in aviation as well, where every year you do see some aviation companies that struggle to surrender allowances at the last minute as well. So we'll probably see the same thing. We do have time. That's the good news, I would say, because they don't have to surrender until September 25. At the same time, it is a volatile market. We've seen in Q1 prices around 55 euros, 50 euros, and now back around 70 euros. So it is something that they want to cover as it goes, because they want to include that in the freight rates as well to lock the price of EUAs as well. So it is a substantive cost, I would say, for them that they're facing. Yeah.
Okay, thank you. Jose, I'll turn to you. Picking up on some of what Nico said there, where are the ETS costs actually going to fall for the shipping sector? Is it clear who's actually going to be paying the carbon price? And how are companies thinking about, should they allocate this price in their contracts?
That's a great question, right? I mean, I think ultimately the short answer is we're all going to be paying for it. For all the goods that we, of course, have shipped around the world, we will be paying in a way, right? Those costs that are passed down eventually. But in reality, of course, how these costs are, let's say, distributed through contracts, right, between ship owners, operators, charterers, that's something that gets ironed out over time, right? I was speaking to a very large, drinks company that has a very huge freight team, and they like to manage their commodity risk across, fuel as well as grains and so on and so forth. But they didn't know what their carbon exposure was in their freight contracts. They had no clue because their shippers didn't know either. And that's the measurement issue we have here. And it's one of the biggest challenges indeed to allocate, measure, which is of course one thing that you're clearly headed in the right direction for. But it's the allocation, the contract work, and the negotiations and the good relations you have between all these parties. So that's quite significant. But ultimately it gets passed on. That's the view, of course, as to why also there is no free allocation. Same view that you'll have also in aviation. So that's I would say the kind of crux of it. Yeah.
Okay, and I mean, do you see the ETS price as a risk that companies in the shipping sector should now be hedging against?
Yes, absolutely. Just about.
I think move a bit closer.
Oh, sorry. Yeah, we're sharing a mic, so absolutely. I mean, just a couple of weeks ago, right? We were we moved about 25% just over the past 2 weeks. Q1 we saw prices very low, and yes, costs are passed on, which you might say does not really incentivize the shipping company to really hedge, but it is more complicated than that because you start opening up questions about counterparty risk, and who has the responsibility to comply, financing, and all those sorts of considerations that you have to take. We have a lot of trades now which are very ad hoc. Sure, okay, you already book a voyage. The trip is planned and you buy the allowances for that. But we're starting to see a little bit more structure there where you buy more regularly, maybe daily if you have a big enough volume. A lot of these clips are very small, especially since we're being phased in. And then how those match up, of course, to invoicing and the contracts that they sign, right? The BIMCO is a monthly settlement, right, as a standard. And that, of course, again, contract work is the guiding principle out of all of this. So depending on what your contracts say, that should have a big impact on a lot of, on your bottom line as a shipping company. And I don't know, maybe some companies can simply just charge a flat price and still expect their clients to come to them, irrespective of what their hedging strategy is. But it could be, of course, a great advantage to show your clients that you're on top of this and that you manage the risk for them, and that's, of course, of great value to the end client.
Thank you. Nico and Trifon, you're working with companies directly on developing these compliance strategies. So what are those strategies looking like so far, if indeed they exist at this stage? Are companies, thinking ahead to the years where coverage of emissions will ramp up in the ETS, or are they taking a more short-term view for now?
So yeah, I would say it really depends on the type of company. So you have companies like cruise ship companies that have more visibility on their emissions. And on the other side, you have like the bulk or the tanker that have way less visibility on what the emissions are going to be. So if you're a cruise ship company or container ship company, where they have more transparency or they know what their emissions roughly are going to be, then you start seeing, at least at the beginning, that they start hedging or at least buying more and more from time to time, as mentioned. And some of them will take opportunities. So when prices were lower, they would probably be buying more as well. So we're starting to see that on the spot market, but also starting to look at how they can optimize the cash flows, buying forward, buying futures as well. Because at the end of the day, for some of those companies, it can be a lot of money. So that's the ones that have visibility on emissions. On the other side, you have like the traders, or like more like the sector where Trifon works a lot, so the dry and the tanker sector, where there it's really ad hoc. I would say they actually don't know if their vessel is going to go to Europe, so they can't really plan ahead. Some of them, large ones, can plan ahead, but a lot of them can't plan ahead. So to José's point, it's all about like essentially booking those allowances as they know they're going to Europe. So it really depends. You have a lot of different strategies, and it depends also on the sector, how big the company is. So we're really seeing a bit of everything, really.
Yeah, no, I mean, just to pick up on that, I think what people don't realize is, if you are trading spot, and we say in the industry, trading spot with a ship, you don't necessarily know what you're going to be doing in terms of employment. So, we'll have some owners saying, look, okay, we'll trade in and out of Europe. Bear in mind, when that obligation is created, from that time point to the point where they actually have to do the surrender of the allowances, it could be in excess of a year. So you are, as a ship owner, sort of you're sort of squeezed in between, let's say, this chain of passing that cost through, because ultimately, as José was saying, it's all of us, we are the end consumers. That cost will be passed through to the end consumer. And so that shipping entity, let's say, has to manage that exposure through that time period, and that can be quite tricky because, the EUA price, as we know, is a floating price, it's not fixed. So, what we recommend also to the ship owners is, just take a physical allowance. How many allowances you'll be incurring. Just ask your charterer or whoever's buying the physical freight from you to take those allowances from them. Then you have another problem, is the ability of the parties to be able to transfer those allowances. And I think that's what we're seeing now. I think the reality is we have very limited practical experience of how this regulation's working. I think for the shipping, it's still bedding down. We have this moment now where everybody's just sort of trying to find their way. On the oil and sort of oil side, let's say on the tanker side, the wet side, you know, you've got major oil companies, oil traders. They're just saying, tell us how much you need. We don't actually want to even get involved with transferring physical allowances, which is quite surprising because you would have thought most of these companies do have a carbon desk probably. So it's that sort of moment now where you will have those owners who are sort of seeing how they can set up these compliance accounts. That in itself is quite challenging, depending on which administering authority they will be falling under. The EC published this list at the end of January, and basically the shipping companies have 40 days to set up this compliance account. And there again, you know, we're seeing a lot of challenges as well. So we see the Spanish authority, for example, they haven't, was with a colleague, we were discussing this the other day for a client, you know, they will have to go and do their MOHA, there's this Maritime Operating Holding Account in the Spanish administering authority, and they haven't even agreed on how much they will charge to set up those accounts yet. So until you know that cost, you can't go ahead. So I think there are a lot of admin challenges still that needs to be overcome there. Yeah.
Go ahead.
But just to add a little bit more on that topic, I think it's not very, let's say, sexy to say, but indeed admin issues are actually a big problem in all of these relationships, right? Because if the costs are being passed on to you, you might have the view that you want to take control of that exposure, right? And maybe hedge yourself. But if you are, a foreign company that, based in South America or in Asia, and you have a carbon exposure through, your freight contracts, how are you going to open up a trading account? It's very complex, difficult. It's a huge administrative burden. And we're finding that, the relationships are also quite complex, where you might have third-party deliveries. Sure, you're trading with one counterparty, but then they're actually, let's say, buying kind of on behalf of one of their charterers. So it starts to get complex in the sense that it's actually an admin mid-office job, which most companies are not familiar with. They don't have the registries anyway, so nobody knows how these registries work, except for a lot of the European companies that, of course, have an exposure to the ETS. So, one of the big things that we have been, offering to our maritime clients at ACT is giving them a halfway house and offering, the admin service in order to kind of help alleviate that, because it is a lot more than people realize. And then once you have, a huge fleet that you need to allocate, and again through different SPVs for different ships and all these complex relationships, it starts to become quite a lot of transfers of small volumes that nobody wants to do. I'm telling you, I don't want to do it, but we do have a guy that we pay. So, but yeah, that's I think a really big, funnily enough, a really big issue that nobody really, I think, brings up that much. Yeah.
Okay, nobody likes admin. I wanted to ask you about the sort of bigger picture for the sector. I mean, it's an innately global industry, international industry, and the emissions from the shipping sector are affected by all sorts of things, including geopolitics. I mean, one example recently is the Red Sea crisis, and whether this is potentially going to lead to an increase in emissions if it means routes are rerouted and become longer, speeds rise, etc. More vessels are being used to catch up. I just wondered, could you sort of share your thoughts on the geopolitical or some of the global issues that are really going to determine the maritime sector's emissions in the next few years? Go ahead.
Yeah. So I think a lot of what's been happening in the Middle East obviously has an impact, and that's directly clear when it comes to the fact that, well, there are more ships and they're moving faster, burning more fuel, and I think that's a very clear impact. Yes, sure, but it's important to remember that the EU ETS as a whole is much, much bigger, and it's difficult for the maritime industry itself to have such a huge impact when the main contributor to EU emissions are, of course, utilities, power generation, and the combustion of fuels at industrial sites. So yes, geopolitical impacts, the market quite a bit, right? So, but mostly on energy, gas prices, coal prices. Clearly that is more important, I would say, as a driver to the EUA price. As you can see, as you might have seen with the Russian invasion of Ukraine, there were huge price swings, about 30+% within very short periods of time, both up and down. And that is just purely on energy security and what people are going to be burning to stay warm during the winter. So yeah, geopolitical impact, yes, but maybe not quite as strong through the maritime industry than it is on power generation.
Okay, Trifon, what's your view on this? What are the sort of key metrics, commodities, factors that you watch when thinking about how to predict maritime emissions developments?
Yeah, look, I mean, again, when you talk about, you point out this Red Sea conflict, and so let's say that conflict in that region forcing ships to reroute, you're probably talking an extra 10 days steaming to go via Cape versus going through Suez. So it's an extra 10 days. I think in the end of the day, I disagree. I don't think ships will run faster or slower due to that. Maybe through a pirate zone they may speed up, but I think in the end of the day, it's sort of where the freight market is how it will dictate how fast a ship will go. In terms of impact on the EUA price, I think to contextualize it, and this is what we certainly tell our clients is, the shipping industry, we're price takers, essentially, on this ETS system. Shipping now with a 40% phase-in is probably accounting for, what, 30 million? Is it something like that? 35 million, yeah. 35 million 40%, yeah. in tons of CO2, so of a market which is 1.4 billion.
Yeah, maybe a bit less number, yeah.
A little bit less, maybe.
Yeah, 1.3, yeah.
So I think when you look at those numbers, you realize actually how small shipping is in all of this. And certainly I know our shipping clients, they like to trade, the shipping people. They go like, okay, how can we sort of, buy, sell EUAs? And you just say, look, relax. You're not going to be the ones dictating how that price is moving. It's going to be like the power utilities, the big, let's say, contributors to that system. So I think from a maritime perspective, the impact on the EUA price, will more emissions be created routing longer? Yes. Will that impact the EUA price? Probably not. I doubt it, because it would be like a drop in the ocean, I think, in terms of the volumes.
Okay, thank you. So currently the ETS Maritime is covering 50% of international emissions from international trips to and from Europe. The ETS directive does say, however, that if the IMO doesn't develop carbon pricing policies by 2028, the EU could consider raising that share of the amount of international emissions covered. Nico, I wondered, are you and your clients preparing for, all international emissions to be brought into the EU ETS?
I think they have no clue really in general that might come. as Trifon said, I think they are very like the sector as a whole is very quick to react to things, but they're also not so good at planning, I would say. So like in general, like from what we see, is like they take it really day by day, waiting for the regulation to come in, waiting to see the discussions at the IMO level, what is decided, if there is indeed like some kind of levy or ETS type scheme implemented on that side. But it's really a day-to-day, and at the end of the day, they do pass on the costs. So it's, they're waiting to wait and see. Essentially, that's really like the approach. Some of them don't even believe on the fact that they'll have to buy allowances eventually. So there's this type of guys as well. That's wait and see essentially.
Okay. Well, just to pick up on the idea of passing on costs to consumers, there was a report by the NGO Transport and Environment earlier this year, which said that some companies are passing on a surcharge that is actually higher than their compliance costs under the ETS, and thus essentially making a profit from being under the EU ETS. I wondered, what's your reaction to that sort of idea that companies may even be using this compliance scheme to their financial advantage?
I can maybe add some to that. I mean, like the study was about container ships, I believe. So those guys are very large entities, and they need to pass on the cost, but it's not something that they can change day to day, I would say. So they do have to be somehow conservative on the price of allowances they're going to take. And probably at the end of last year, when they started thinking about those numbers, prices were close to 90 euros. And so as it came down, they probably, indeed, took advantage of the fact that prices were lower and, likely locked some profit. But we do see that in general with owners. I mean, owners, they're not always very smart traders. They own vessels, they operate the vessels. They might be a bit conservative or a bit expensive. So that's something we would push as well for the charterers to actually look at how can they optimize this cost, because it makes more sense at the end of the day that I think that the charterer looks at it, because they're more traders and used to trading way more, I would say, than owners. At least that's what I see. Yeah.